Well, first, the question everybody's, I'm sure, is wondering is how many more of these is this guy going to make us listen to? And I'm telling you, it's going to be two, including this one. So this one more, and I'm almost afraid to say this. My last one will probably be a little bit shorter, but we'll see. But just two, and like I said, I'm trying to think how I got through all of this in 5 days at a Bible school. But anyways, I actually was looking forward to giving it like this because there's so much more to it, and in this kind of format, you can talk about all the things that really need to be talked about, or at least some of them. But last time, it's been a few weeks now, but we ended with the rebirth of Israel on May 14th, 1948. We saw some videos of when it was declared, and we talked about some passages that showed this, that prophesied of this time. Micah 5 up on the board at the screen, talking about giving them up, the Jews, until the time that she which travaileth hath brought forth. Then the remnant of his brethren shall return to the children of Israel. So this is the ending of God giving them up. But I found another verse this morning, and I was actually looking for a different one, and it was so perfect for this that I wanted to start with that. And this the bottom one there, Micah 4 verses 6 through 7, and it's from that we will kind of catapult moving forward. So if you look that up, Micah 4 verses 6 and 7, this will sum up what we were talking about and carry us into what we are going to talk about. Micah 4 verses 6 and 7. It says, In that day, saith the Lord, will I assemble her that halteth, and I will gather her that is driven out, and her that I have afflicted. And I will make her that halted a remnant, and her that was cast far off a strong nation. And the Lord shall reign over them in Mount Zion from henceforth, even forever. So it's important here to note that God's going to gather those that were driven out. So obviously, Roman Jewish wars and resulted in the Jews being expelled from the land. But it says that God did this. Gather her that is driven out, and her that I have afflicted. So that was God's punishment on them. And he was using the Romans as a means of accomplishing that. But, in verse 7, he's going to gather them. And those that were cast off, he's going to make them a strong nation. And the Lord shall reign over them. So, today, Israel is a strong nation. I think there's some that would say, well, no, that's talking about when Christ is ruling there. But I think that, especially in terms of what they were when they were scattered, they are a strong nation. But, obviously, the Lord does not reign over them yet. So if you look at that little colon, I think it's a colon, that's the one. Semicolon's got the little swoosh on the bottom. Look at that colon. I think as far as where, on a timetable, we are right there. Israel is a strong nation. We simply wait for the Lord to reign over them in Mount Zion from henceforth, even forever. So, with that, there's another prophecy I wanted to talk about. And if you turn over to Matthew 24, this is talking about the rebudding of the fig tree. So Matthew 24, 29 to 35. Everybody turn up there. It's Matthew 24, excuse me, verses 29 through 35. It says, And immediately after the tribulation of those days, and I believe that when it says those days, it's talking about the Roman Jewish wars, destruction of Jerusalem. After the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn. And they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender, and putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is nigh. So likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass away, or pass, till all these things be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. And obviously we could go on because there's a lot of other important things there. But, like I mentioned, there's three different records of the Olivet prophecy, and all of them structured a little bit differently. And so sometimes it seems it can be difficult to discern which parts are referring to what. Because there's a couple different questions the disciples had asked that Christ is answering. But my view is that in verse 29, he's talking about the tribulation of those days, talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, the scattering of the Jews, and he's talking about the sun being darkened, moon not giving light. So basically the heavens are darkened. And I think this is talking about the political heavens of Israel. After they had been dispersed, there's no Israel in the political heavens, so it's darkened. But in verse 30, then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth shall mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man. So whatever it is, I'm all out of order here, but we'll cover all this stuff. There's a sign of the Son of Man in heaven before Christ actually appears. So Christ is not the sign of the Son of Man. He is the Son of Man. There's something that is a sign or symbol of him, marking, I think, a time period. Well, I'll just say it. I think that's talking about the rebirth of Israel. When it says the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, those heavens that were darkened, it's in the heavens again. Israel is a nation again. And then, obviously this is unfulfilled yet, but Christ returning, coming to the nations, gathering his saints. I think that happens before he appears to the nations. But the important part of this is what he relates this to in verse 32. So he says, here's all these things that are going to happen, but learn the parable of a fig tree. And that's actually a fig tree down at the bottom of the screen there. But when you see its leaves shooting forth, you know that summer is nigh. It tells you, when you see this certain thing, you know what is about to come. It's a clear marker of what's in the future. So likewise, when you see all of these things I'm telling you about, know that it is at the door. This generation will not pass away till all of these things be fulfilled. So what is he talking about here? Oh, dang it. Man, I wish I could go back with this. Anyways, there's a couple verses I want to look up. Firstly, Jeremiah 24, 1 through 6. And this is on the point that when he's talking about a fig tree, he's talking about Israel. Because Israel, in Jeremiah 24 there, also Hosea 9 and Joel 1, we won't look those up, but those are just instances where Israel is likened to a fig tree. So Jeremiah 24, 1 through 6, that's what we will look up. If I get there, I'll read it. The first 6 verses of Jeremiah 24. The word that came to Jeremiah concerning all the people of Judah in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, that was the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. That which Jeremiah the prophet spake unto all the people of Judah and to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, saying, I'll tell you what, let's just skip down to verse, am I in the right chapter here? Jeremiah 24, yeah. It's not talking about fig trees yet. I must have wrote down the wrong verse. Verse 2? Maybe so. Well, either way, there's a verse, I thought it was Jeremiah. It's talking about, I'm Jeremiah 25. Sorry. I guess I didn't get enough sleep last night. Actually, that's Jeremiah 24. Let's start with verse 2. Okay, not 25. One basket had very good figs, even like the figs that are first ripe, and the other basket had very naughty figs, which could not be eaten. They were so bad. Then said the Lord unto me, What seest thou, Jeremiah? And I said, Figs. The good figs very good, and the evil very evil. They cannot be eaten, they are so evil. Again the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, Like these good figs, so will I acknowledge them that are carried away captive of Judah, whom I have sent out of this place into the land of the Chaldeans for their good. For I will set my eyes upon them for good, and will bring them again to this land, and I will build them and not pull them down, and I will plant them and not pluck them up. So here, it's talking about the Jews being carried away into captivity. There were some that were very good and some that were bad, but the good ones he was going to bring back. So again, just the aspect of the Jews are likened to the figs. But if you look at Matthew 21, this is where, this is obviously before the Olivet prophecy we were just talking about, Matthew 24. But you wonder, like, okay, why in Matthew 24, why is Christ talking about a fig tree? Now, when you see a fig tree bud, then you know that summer's nigh. Well, I think it relates to what he did back in Matthew 21. And verse 18 we'll start at. I'm going to make sure I'm reading from the right chapter this time. Now in the morning, as he returned into the city, he hungered. And when he saw a fig tree in the way, he came to it, and found nothing thereon, but leaves only, and said unto it, Let no fruit grow on thee henceforth forever. And presently the fig tree withered away. And when the disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, How soon is the fig tree withered away? So this is a figure of Israel. This represented Israel. They had leaves, and if you look in just to the times of the year and all this was, by all means, if it had leaves, it should have had fruit on it at the time. So it had the appearance of righteousness, but they didn't have the fruit of that. That's the state that Israel was in when Christ was there. And so he cursed it, and it withered away, just like what happened to Judah with the Romans in AD 66 to 135. It withered away. But that brings us to Matthew 24. It says, when you see this budding, know that all these things are coming to pass. So, I think he's talking about the rebudding of the fig tree, or the rebirth of Israel. And I kind of mentioned things already. Political heavens were darkened after the Roman and Jewish wars. Sign of the man to appear before Christ himself. And obviously, Israel is a nation. It was a huge marker. If we're just, when you're looking at prophecy, you're looking at the nations and what's going on in political heavens. The rebirth of Israel is a cataclysmic event. But in the account in Luke 21, we won't look this up. Matthew 24, it says, when you see, where is it at? You learn the parable of the fig tree. When you shall see, these things come to pass. And it says, behold the fig tree and all the trees in Luke 21. So he's talking about not just the fig tree, but there's these other trees that are going to shoot forth at the same time. And I think that's talking about the Arab nations. Like Psalm 83, all those nations didn't really exist in the form that they did until about the time Israel was reborn. All the time through World War I, World War II, that's when those other trees shot forth, just like when Israel did. And as they're very important players in the latter-day wars, it's important that I think it mentions all the trees, because it's got to have a meaning. It wasn't just thrown in there for no reason. So I think in the Luke 21, it talks about not just the rebirth of Israel, but all the other trees around them that would shoot forth at the same time. Not fig trees, because they're not Israel, but other trees. But the relevance of this, this generation shall not pass away till all these things be fulfilled. So what generation is that? And the only thing we can really conclude is that it's talking about the fig tree generation. 1948, basically, if we look at Israel as a person, they were born in 1948. They are 75 years old now. And if we're trying to figure out what a generation is, there's a couple different thoughts on that. But one, and probably the most clear that I can find, is defined in Psalm 90, verse 10. I won't look it up, but basically it says, our years are 70 years, if by strength they are 80. So Israel is now 75 years old. And if this is the correct understanding of a generation, I think we can see the implications of this. That generation will not pass away. So basically, we don't want to put a number on it, but if this is correct, 5 years is what we're talking about, when all these things shall be fulfilled. And again, this may be the right interpretation of a generation. It may not be. I don't know any others that are a clear number, though, but either way, it's reason for us to be watching for sure. Now, last time I think I briefly mentioned we're going to see some other ways that prophecy was fulfilled during these time periods. Back in Genesis, God had told Abraham that I'm going to bless those that bless you and curse them that curse you. And this has just been the standard law, really, for any nation's dealings with Israel. If they bless Israel, they do well. If they curse Israel, they don't do well. And we see some very clear examples in this time period. And we're only going to look at two. The first is Ernest Bevin. I know a lot of people, when they hear that name, they're probably hissing right now because just like the Jews said here, the Jews, they considered Ernest Bevin throughout this period of rebirth to be the number one enemy of Zionism. He's the one that kept the Jews from going to the land. He's the one that shipped them back to the concentration camps. I mean, in every way, he was an enemy of the Jews. And Chaim Weizmann, who would later be the first president of Israel, said that Mr. Bevin is our sworn enemy. So here's some of the stuff he did. Like, again, he rejected the Holocaust survivors. He brought up the issue of the Jews to the United Nations, not really seeking advice, but hoping that they would punish the Jews in ways that he would not be able to. Ended up backfiring. And again, he sent them back to Germany to teach them a lesson. And as a result of that, Britain after World War II was bread rationing, and they were more impoverished after the war than they were any time during the war. And because of that, they had to get a huge loan from the United States, which effectively made Britain a puppet of Truman. So Ernest Bevin obviously did not favor the Jews, tried to work against them, but Harry Truman on numerous occasions basically twisted his arm and says, "You're going to do what I want you to do, or you guys won't, we won't be able to get you the bread and stuff you guys need." So very bad situation for him. But I mean, even in Britain, his whole political stature was soiled because of how he handled these things. Curse the Jews, he would therefore be cursed. But on a much better note, we have Truman himself. The greatest champion of, as far as a political figure or non-Jewish political figure of the Zionist cause. So again, like I mentioned, he had coerced Britain's policy in favor of a Jewish state. He is the one who pushed for partition at the UN vote November 1947. Because it was just him. The State Department of the United States was completely against partition. They were pro-Arab because there were more Arabs than Jews. But because of Truman alone, they were able to push for partition. And again, he alone recognized the nation of Israel 11 minutes after it was born. Again, against the advice of his State Department. So because of that, this is, remarkable. So May 1948, Israel became a nation. He declared, he recognized the state. November of that year, it was an election year. And he was going up against Thomas Dewey. And they're not kidding when they say everybody thought Truman was going to lose. His wife, his mother-in-law, his mother thought he had no chance of winning. Because this other guy was just a flamboyant personality. You can see. Look, this is a newspaper that was printed. Dewey defeats Truman. Chicago Daily Tribune published. All the polls said Dewey wins by a landslide, and they were so confident they already printed their newspapers. But he woke up the next morning and he had won by a landslide. So again, only person that thought he was going to win was him. And seeing his role with Israel, I can't conclude that God's hand was not in that. I will bless them that bless you. So, we move on to what happened after Israel became a nation. So everybody knew, Arabs, Jews, British, everybody alike knew, as soon as the British left and the nation of Israel was declared, war would begin. And it actually had technically begun with the UN vote, but basically, with the British still technically occupying the land and a nation of Israel non-existent, the Jews could not bring in arms legally. If you're not a nation, you can't do that legally. So they had to sneak Jewish fighters in. And when I say fighters, I mean just Jews from all around the world. They weren't trained fighters, they were just Jews. But they also had to sneak weapons in. But once a nation was declared, legally they could do those things. So it was really a race of time for existence. They knew once we get all the tanks and planes and ammunition that we had bought overseas, once we can get that into the land and get more of our fighters in here, we can stand a chance. So basically, and I've been trying to think how to word this the best. They declare a nation. They have to fight off long enough to get all those other things, tanks and stuff, into the land. Once they do that, they could have a fighting chance. But they just hoped that the Arabs wouldn't destroy them fast enough. So it was very, very difficult situation. I think that's the worst way I could have explained that, but I don't know how else to do it right now. But basically, the next morning after Israel declared itself a nation, 5 a.m., Egypt and their Air Force bombed Tel Aviv, so it had officially begun. But all these nations came against Israel. Egypt, Transjordan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. And on top of that, there are a bunch of these Arab militias, or Arab Muslim militias, that had organized themselves to fight against the Jews. Now, obviously, as this book says, they, talking about the Arabs, enjoyed a clear margin of superiority in basically every single way. Now, the Arab Legion, this was Transjordan's army. This was no doubt the very best trained, the best equipped. They were actually trained by the British, and they were also led by British officials. So these are British people fighting against the Jews. Now, the Arab Legion is made up of Arab and Muslim fighters, but again, they're trained by the British and they're led by the British. So much for being a friend of Israel. But by declaring itself a state, Israel isolated itself from anybody's help. Because, from another nation's point of view, it would seem that they are taking sides, national sides, supporting the Jews instead of trying to be an intermediary party trying to negotiate. So the Jews knew that when they were voting, Ben-Gurion and his cabinet, when they were voting as to whether they were even going to declare a state or not, this was a consideration. If we do this, we are completely on our own. And they decided to do it. So these are just some pictures of some of the forces. On the left there, those are some of the Jews. Some of them were part of the Haganah, which was called meaning defense. And on the right, there's some Arab militias and some of the Transjordanian armies. The guy on the bottom there with the white, I don't know if that's technically called a turban, but his name's Hajuman Husseini, huge friend of Hitler, obviously enemy of the Jews. Big figure in this point of time. But the whole war, the entire set of events is just riddled with the divine hand. And we don't have time to discuss all of those, but we'll talk about some of them. And obviously, God blessed Israel in this. I mean, the fact that they existed through this without being completely destroyed is absolutely remarkable. They had some training, but whatever they could provide themselves. But these are very much so ragtag forces. These are new immigrant fighters, so there's a language barrier. I mean, it was literally the Haganah told Jews across the world, said, we will help you get to Israel on the one condition that when you get here, you'll immediately help us start fighting. And they didn't speak the same language, so that was a huge barrier, but they were still able to make this work. Obviously, they were outnumbered, and they wouldn't outnumber the Arabs finally until towards the end of the war. And obviously, they were outgunned as well. And at the outset, this is incredible, at the outset of the war, they only had enough ammunition for 3 days of fighting. And they were still able to win by getting all these extra resources into the land. Now, this is incredible. The people on the right, I think those are part of this Gadna force. Now, a lot of the times, the Jews and the Haganah had recruited young kids to run ammunition, run letters. They were small, they were fast. typically between 12 and 16 years old. And at one point, they actually had to engage in some fighting. And I forget what battle this was part of, but basically it was this Gatineau youth had been trapped in this building by the Arab Legion, which again is the number one, the best fighting force in this whole army. And I'll just read this here. It says, the fighting was savage, with grenades and bayonets, yet the Gatineau youngsters, many of them only 16, and in action for the first time, succeeded in holding the Legionnaires to half a dozen rooms. So they ended up getting out of there okay, but they were fending off 16-year-olds who had never fought before, fending off the best trained army in the entire war. And there's a bunch of other examples of this kind of thing, but when it talks about the Lord fighting for Israel, I'm getting ahead of myself, but you can see God is definitely blessing these people. Conversely, God cursed the Arabs. This was a ship called the Lino, and this was critical for the Arabs because it had tons and tons of ammunition and weapons. It had 6,000 rifles and over 8 million rounds of ammunition. As it was making its way across the Mediterranean, a storm grounded it and sank it, basically, and obviously soiled all the ammunition. They were able to recover some of the stuff, but it took them a long time to clean all the guns, and obviously the ammunition, a lot of that was wasted. But it stalled the Arabs, and which was a great benefit for the Jews. This man, Abdul Qadir Husseini, was the symbol of the Arab fighting spirit, really. He was the most capable general. He was the strongest. But what really made him unique was his ability to unify the Arabs, because they're known for being difficult to unify. But they were able to rally behind him. Now, coincidentally, he was killed in a city town called Castel. There's a bunch of fighting going on there. He was actually killed in that war, that battle, and he typically wasn't involved in those things, but because of the Arab morale at the time, he said, I need to be a part of this. I'm going to be a face. I'm going to be present in this battle, and he ended up getting killed. And this is what one of the Arabs had to say. There is something in our blood, and his name was Emil Gori who said this, but there's something in our blood that ascribes such importance to the man, such hero worship to the leader, that when he dies, everything collapses. So basically, all the Arab forces put their trust in him. He was the symbol of their victory, and when he was killed, that spirit was completely taken away. They no longer had their organizing general, and I mean, it was critical. And this is 1 month before Israel even became a nation. Very, very timely. This was a town called Deir Yassin, and there were, just like Castel, there was a lot of fighting that went on in there. But the Irgun, which is what many consider a terrorist organization of the Jews, basically they went in and they took over the town, killed a bunch of people. The casualties and the atrocities committed in this have been over-exaggerated by the Arab inhabitants, but there's a lot of terrible stories of stuff that happened. But the Arabs, some of them were appalled at this, obviously, but a lot of the leaders saw this as, okay, now this is a rallying cry for our fighters. They're going to see this. They're going to be invigorated to fight against the Jews stronger than ever. It had the opposite effect, actually. A lot of the inhabitants fled out of fear. Again, it was the exact opposite of what the Arabs thought was going to be. And it's for that reason that they were over-exaggerating the atrocities. The worse they made it sound to be, the more, at least they reasoned, the Arabs would be inspired to fight. And instead it scared them all, and they ran away. And the Jews were able to move in without even fighting a lot of these places. Let's look up, we won't look up all those. If you write those down, but Deuteronomy 11:25, I think speaks directly to this kind of thing when the Lord is working with his people. Deuteronomy 11:25 says, There shall no man be able to stand before you, for the Lord your God shall lay the fear of you and the dread of you upon all the land that ye shall tread upon, as he has said unto you. And I mean, the Jews, in seeing this, they said we couldn't have asked for something better than this. This wasn't, like I said, the Arabs had kind of over exaggerated what had happened. The Jews couldn't have made this work out better for them. They were able to occupy all these other places without even having to fight. And I think that too was the Lord's doing. Now, I think this is an important subject, how the Lord has fought for Israel in the past, because particularly when we're talking about latter-day wars, I think our minds immediately go to Christ physically being present. When the Lord fights against a nation, it's talking about, like fire from heaven, some kind of miraculous show that, this has to be divine. There's no other way. It has to be God doing it. But when it talks about the Lord fighting for Israel in the past, and particularly the conquering of the land under Joshua, we see a very different story. And there are instances, for sure, of God, calling fire from heaven and all these, opening the earth and swallowing up armies. He does that. But there's a lot of instances where he doesn't. He works through natural means. Just for instance, we won't read these, but if you jot them down and look them up later, in Joshua 10, verses 29 through 42, this is talking about when Ai, no, I'm sorry, talks about just a list, and Joshua and then they took this, and they fought against this and took that. And here's how it describes it. And it says, all these kings and their land did Joshua take at one time, because the Lord God of Israel fought for Israel. But if you look up those passages, there's not a single instance of a miraculous show of power, if you understand what I mean. God fought for Israel through Israel. He blessed their efforts. And the same is true of Joshua 7 and 8. I think this should be the account of Ai. I should have wrote that down. But basically with Ai, God was telling Joshua what to do, and they took the city, but it was through tactics. Again, it wasn't through God opening up the earth or just having an angel smite the armies in the middle of the night. God told Joshua, here's what you need to do. And so that victory is still attributed to God. The same exact principle is true of Israel today. And I think particularly with this war. If we look at Zechariah 14, Zechariah 12 through 14 is, I think, just such an important set of passages. But starting back in chapter 13, verse 7, and moving forward, I think we have a chronological prophecy starting with the crucifixion of Christ and moving forward to the time when he comes to conquer these other nations. Now, this brings us to chapter 14. And I don't believe Christ has returned to the earth at this point yet. But it says, verses 1 through 3, behold, the day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and half of the city shall go forth into captivity. And the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations, as when he fought in the day of battle. Now, sometimes it says he's going to gather all nations against Jerusalem. This is not literally all nations, because firstly, there's literally not enough land in Israel to house all nations, or even the armies of all nations. Israel is the size of New Jersey. It just would not work. But particularly with the context, and I think it's verse 14 of chapter 14, it talks about which enemies this is talking about. It says the spoil of the heathen round about is gathered by Israel. So when it says all nations, I think it's talking about all nations of the land. And when you look at all the people that came against Israel at this time, there's no other way to describe it. These are all nations of the land. These are 7 nations working together to erase Israel. But in this war, and I think this is critical, Israel lost half of Jerusalem. Jerusalem has been fought over and taken over probably more times than any other town, really. But never has it been split in half, like the scriptures say here, except for during this war. So that caused me to look, could this possibly be referring to, because a lot of people look at this, particularly John Thomas and people who lived long ago, thought this was talking about a future time. But again, now, looking to the past, 48, we have one instance when half of Jerusalem went into captivity. Could this be referring to that? And my conclusion is yes. Now, there are two parts of Jerusalem today. There's a modern part, which is obviously new, but then there's the old half. So they call it the new half and the old half, which is the old has existed for thousands of years. Israel lost the old half during this war. Now, the new half, we can see throughout this time period, God had sustained Israel, or the Jews, to keep this, to prevent them from losing it. Now, during this time, and it was actually, I think it even might have started with the UN vote, the Arabs put Jerusalem under siege. So just like the Romans did in AD 70, they surrounded it, they prevented any food and water from going in. The goal was basically to starve the inhabitants into submission. That's what the Arabs did. People in Jerusalem were starving. In order to combat this, the Jews had convoys. They would makeshift armored cars and try to ram them through. But the Arabs would jump on their car. I mean, so many people died doing this, trying to get food to Jerusalem. And many of the inhabitants almost starved to death. I mean, there's this book, O Jerusalem, I refer to a lot, talks about it a lot, and just the rationing that they had to go through just to make it. But were it not for some show of providence, they would not have been able to last. I'll read this here. It says, Jerusalem being Jerusalem, the city could not endure a siege without some manifestation of providence. And again, this book is not talking about how these are fulfillments of prophecy. This is just saying what happened. In April, before the Naxon convoys arrived, so those are some of the Jewish convoys trying to get food to them, it says, a weed called kubeza had provided a miraculous relief to the hungry population. The spinach-like herb sprang up wild in the fields after the spring rains. It was nutritious, filling, and full of vitamins. Women scoured the fields of the city looking for it, and before it disappeared, it had even made its appearance on the menu of the Hotel Eden as spinach croquettes. Probably said that wrong. But suddenly, just before the British left, a wholly unseasonable 3-day rain struck Jerusalem, bringing a new and totally unexpected crop of kubeza pushing up from the soil. Ah, said the city's salons, the Lord is with us. The last time when we left Egypt, he sent us manna. This time, he sent us rain for the cisterns and the kubeza. So this wholly unseasonable 3-day rain filled up their cisterns, so they had enough water to get by, and it also gave this unseasonally crop of kubeza, which just happened to be some super filling, nutritious thing. Now, they were still starving by the end of this, but they made it, and they were alive. And it would not have been possible were it not for this. Now, on the other hand, with the old half of Jerusalem, God had blessed the Arabs. It's really incredible. I mean, you see God giving the Arabs all this momentum, and then he just throws the brakes on it and makes them hit a brick wall. Now, they were given enough momentum to capture the old city, and obviously this is Jerusalem. The old city and the new city are right next to each other. Once they take the old, it's very logical to go to the new. But he gave them enough momentum to capture the old city, but stopped them. So, this just talks about when they captured it. From the new city, they could see the Arab Legion's flag in the old city, showing that the Legion had taken over. And the fighting was just terribly, terribly bitter. The Jews were literally running out of ammunition. I forget how many rounds they had when the fighting stopped, but I think it was like 100. It was almost basically out. But the result of this was some 1,300 residents of the Jewish quarter started over the 500 yards, separating them from the Zion Gate and the new city. Their departure marked the end of almost 2,000 years of continuous Jewish residence inside the old walls of Jerusalem. So the Arab Legion captured the old city. They expelled all the Jewish inhabitants. And that would have been the first time there were no Jews in the Old City in 2,000 years. Now, this is what's interesting. The general, Arab general, who allowed them to capture the Old City, his name was Abdullah Tell, brilliant soldier general. Um, Obviously, morale for the Arabs was very high at this point, and he wanted to obviously continue and take all of Jerusalem, take the other half. But both sides had opted to accept a 30-day ceasefire. Now, Abdullah Tell and his forces, obviously, they said, no, we need to keep going. We have momentum. If we stop, we will never be able to regain this. But the rest of the Arab nations decided, who weren't present for this, they decided, we need to stop. We need a break so we can rearm. Long story short, they both ended up accepting this ceasefire. And here's what it did. Talking about Abdullah Tell, it says, never again would he be as close to conquering all Jerusalem as he had been that morning when he had captured the old city. So he would have done it, but the ceasefire stopped them. And this is what the Jews thought of the ceasefire. Moshe Carmel, the commander in the north, summed up the sentiment of all of them, saying that the truce came to us as dew from heaven. So again, the Jews were running out of everything. If this ceasefire had not came into effect, it's very possible that Israel would have completely lost and the Arabs would have succeeded in pushing the Jews to the sea as they wanted to do. But this is where the tide turned. As a result of this, instead of the Arabs being on the offensive, it was the Jews on the offensive, because the Jews used this 30 days to resupply all those other tanks and planes and stuff that they had bought. That was able for them bring time for them to bring all that in, to train these new immigrants to be better fighters. For the first time, the Jews would both outnumber and outgun the Arabs, and everywhere the Israeli forces were going over to the offensive. So if you just take a step back and look at this war, at the beginning, it's the Jews basically fighting to stay alive. Arabs are advancing on every front. Ceasefire kicks in. After the ceasefire, it's the opposite. Jews are expanding and expanding and expanding. Now, they had lost the old city, so obviously, after the ceasefire, their goal was to recapture the old city. But here, God prevented them from recapturing it. We'll talk about why in a minute. I'm determined to at least cover that. Basically, after this ceasefire, there's going to be some more fighting, but the United States, and I think it was the United States, it basically said another ceasefire and a final one is going into effect on this day. If you guys keep fighting after that, we are physically intervening. So it basically gave the Jews and the Arabs no choice. After this final ceasefire would go in effect, they would have to stop fighting. Now, obviously, this was the Jews' perspective here. It was clear to them all that this final ceasefire would end the war, and that what they did not get now might be lost for years, perhaps generations to come. The Jerusalem commander, David Shaltiel, on the left there, reminded his soldiers of the historic importance that the conquest of the old city would have for the state of Israel, for the Jewish people. So he said, in this interim here, before this final ceasefire kicks in, we have to capture the old city, because if we don't do it now, we may never have a chance to do it again. So, and I forget the time frame. They only had like 3 days to plan this out and to actually execute this. And by the time, it really boiled down to, they have to do one thing. There can't be a backup plan because there would be no time for it. So what they decided to do, they had this, I hate to call it a bomb. It was just some huge explosive. It's called the conus because it was kind of a cone-shaped thing. It was 335 pounds, and it was just specifically designed to penetrate through really thick barriers. And their plan was this, basically. They're going to pull this thing up to the old city walls. They're going to blow a hole in it, rush in, capture the old city, and then the ceasefire goes in effect. And therefore, they have all of Jerusalem. And the story is remarkable, really. And this chemist, I don't know, either he created the bomb or he knew about it, said, this will work. There's no reason this will not blow a hole in the wall. Long story short, it took a crew of Jewish soldiers to carry this thing up to the old city walls. And you can imagine there's rocks and debris they're climbing over. They're getting shot at left and right. They get it, and it had to be 6 inches, exactly 6 inches from the wall, and at a certain angle. They got it just right, jumped, covered their ears, and boom, thing blew up, and all Jerusalem shook. I mean, this is a huge, huge explosive. And when the Jewish commanders heard this, I mean, they all cheered. It's like, oh, we've got this. And they were so sure that this plan was going to work. They had already planned everything in advance. So they had a victory speech written up. They had provisional currency printed for all the inhabitants. They had different posters of here's the new rules printed in 3 languages for all the inhabitants. They'd even chosen a governor over the city, and I think even his residents they had picked out. So, I mean, they were positive this is going to work. But after a huge explosion, all this dust in the air, when it finally cleared, it was just a black smudge on the wall. Not a crack, not a chip. It was just a black smudge. Again, by all accounts, it should have blown a hole in the wall, but for some reason it just didn't. And we'll talk about that in a minute here. But long story short, the time ran out. They knew if this didn't work, they were just going to lose the old city for now, and that's exactly what happened. They had to accept the ceasefire, and they had no idea when they were going to be able to recapture the old city. So here's what happened. It was literally split in half, Jerusalem. Surrounded without hope of reinforcement, they, the Jews, finally drew back to the new city on Shealtiel's orders, as their commander, leaving old Jerusalem's ramparts to the Arab Legion. From Sheikh Jarrah in the north to Ramat Rachel in the south, their action left Jerusalem split in half. Again, the writer of this book is not referring to prophecy. He's just telling you this is what happened. And Jerusalem was not a third and 2/3. It split it in half. Upon its capture by the Arab Legion, now if you look at the passage in Zechariah 14, it talks about what happened with the half of the city that went into captivity. This kind of describes it here. Upon its capture by the Arab Legion, the Jewish quarter of the old city was destroyed and its residents expelled. 58 synagogues, some hundreds of years old, were destroyed, their contents looted and desecrated. Some Jewish religious sites were turned into chicken coops or animal stalls. Their cemeteries where they'd been burying their dead for 2,500 years, was ransacked, graves desecrated. Thousands of tombstones were smashed and used as building material, paving stones or for latrines in Arab Legion army camps. The Intercontinental Hotel was built on top of the cemetery, and graves were demolished to make way for a highway to the hotel. The western wall became a slum area. So that is what happened to the old half when it went into captivity. Now, this is what's interesting. We'll end on this. We got to at least talk about this. The old city is where the sanctuary site was. This is where Solomon's temple was. And that is critical to all this. So here's what it looked like. These are the ceasefire lines. That dotted line, that's it's called the green line because that's what the color it was on the map. But that divided Jerusalem. You can see there's a Jewish half on the left, Transjordanian half on the right, and Jerusalem was literally split in half. And this picture up here, that's actually the wall that they had built on that green line, showing this is ours, this is yours. Remarkable. I mean, remarkable, really. I forgot this. Okay, tell you what time did we start? This is just a little video clip that just kind of sums up some of these things. Yeah, we'll just go.
On May the 28th, in Jerusalem, with only 300 rounds of ammunition left and only 36 fighting men still in action, the defenders of the old city had to surrender. Arabs looted the Jewish quarter, destroying dozens of synagogues in their wild rampage. Fewer than 1,200 civilians made their sad, weary way down the slopes of Mount Zion. Their wounds were tended. West of Jerusalem fought on with valor against the Arab Legion, whose morale was now high. Its Jewish population was besieged, threatened with famine and thirst, isolated from the main body of the state, and subjected to an inferno of bombardment day and night. When Jerusalem was under siege, we had reached a point which one of our commanders at that time, General Herzog, has portrayed.
Its water supplies had been cut off, and it was living only on what had been collected in the water cisterns. Everybody was living on 1 pail of water a day for all purposes, and about 3 slices of bread a day. That's all that was left in the city at the time.
So it just shows when the old city was lost. And we got to talk about this, and then we'll stop. Because, why were they not able to recapture the old city? Well, I think it relates directly to another prophecy. This is the prophecy of 2,300 days in Daniel 8. It starts with Alexander the Great, this he-goat, coming against this Persian ram. But at the end of it, it says, Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto the certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? And he said unto me, Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And if you look in the RSV, it says, instead of saying cleanse, it says, Then shall the sanctuary be restored to its rightful state. Now showing, we got to show the time. I think this is when the sanctuary would begin to be cleansed, or again, when it would go to its rightful state or in its rightful hands. It doesn't say it would be fully rebuilt. I think that's important because it's not talking about the rebuilding of the temple, it's just a sanctuary site. Now, it had been in foreign oppressors' hands for thousands of years, but now, I think this is saying it's going to finally be back in the Jewish hands. Now, when does this start? The prophecy starts with this he-goat pushing against the ram. Now, that's Alexander the Great. And what the historians say, what marked this conquest against the Persians was when he crossed the river Granicus, and that he did in the spring of 334 BC. So if we have a starting date, this is a starting date of the prophecy. So we wonder, if you go 200 or 2,300 prophetic days or 2,300 years forward from that date, what do we come up with? When would the sanctuary be restored to its rightful state? And that's what it comes up with. And remarkably, between June 5th and 10th, there was a 6-day war when the Jews recaptured the old city. Paratroopers flew down and they recaptured it, and ever since it has been in Jewish hands. Again, absolutely remarkable. But this explains why the Jews were not able to recapture it back then. It wasn't time yet. That was for the future. And here's this is that O Jerusalem book describing this. June 1967, after twice warning King Hussein to stop shelling in New Jerusalem, Israel went to war with Jordan. Paratroopers of Uzi Narcissus captured the old city after 48 hours of fighting. Once again, Jerusalem was a united city, its two halves rejoined in their common whole, the ugly scars of war removed. Now again, it's not fully cleansed. There's still the Dome of the Rock there, but it's restored to its rightful hands. I think this is the beginning of the cleansing period. And if you look at those other passages, Micah 5:8-13 and Zechariah 13:2, that talks about it will be Christ's role to cleanse the land of unclean spirits and all these other idols and things. So the Dome of the Rock will remain most likely until Christ himself tears it down. And this is what we'll end on. Just what prophecy is. I mean, critics, they look at these things, how detailed these prophecies are, and they say, these were obviously written way after the fact. I mean, I'm reading a book right now. It's the guy's perspective's kind of annoying, but there's some good history that, all the prophecies about Babylon and going back, those were written, way in the future because, and the only reason I say that is there's no way they would be able to know this. So they discount the Bible, but man, we have some things that are so recent here. We have the word written. And these events are very recent to us. So we know for a fact, the prophecy of Zechariah 14 was not written after 1948. It just wasn't. So this is why it is the indisputable truth of prophecy. So just for example, Daniel's prophecy in Daniel 11 talking about how the Ottomans would come to control the land, that was written approximately 536 BC, 2,000 years before the event. How the Ottomans would lose the land in World War I at the end, talking about it at the end of Daniel 11, again written around 536 BC, 2,454 years before the event. This prophecy we just talked about, again approximately written around 536 BC, over 2,500 years before the event. And finally, Christ's prophecy about the fig tree and all the trees when they shoot forth. He spoke that around AD 30, around 1900 years before the event. Again, there's no way this can be contested because we have this. The Bible existed long before Israel was reborn in 1967 and all those other things. So what is sure, if we really want a foundation that the Bible is the Word of God, prophecy provides it in many, many ways. Okay, I'm done. We got one more. I know I'll definitely be able to finish this up in one more. That's a good stopping point. But I mean, really, I don't know how we can look at these things and not see how close Christ is. I mean, there's not a single thing we can point to and say, well, we still got a couple decades or something like that. All signs are pointing to get ready right now. I mean, there's no reason not to, and it'd be a terrible mistake on our part to assume that we have so much more time left. Because I don't know what else the Lord would need to show us to tell us that He is coming and very quickly. Okay, yeah. So real quick, next time we will get into basically from 1967 onward, very briefly, but more so where we're at now and what we expect to come. Real quick though, in the end of Zechariah 14:3 it says, Jerusalem would be divided in half, and then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations. I think part of that is after the ceasefire, and so the Jews went on the offensive everywhere, where God more actively started fighting for the Jews instead of preserving them. But obviously, the rest of that prophecy is yet to be fulfilled because Christ's feet are yet to be on the Mount of Olives. But just some things to think about. But we'll talk about more stuff today and into the future next Sunday.